At 3:42 p.m. local time, far out in the southern Caribbean Sea, the water appeared almost too calm. Moving through that quiet surface was USS George Washington, a major U.S. Navy aircraft carrier operating lawfully in international waters. There were no drills planned, no flight operations in progress, and nothing about the movement seemed out of the ordinary. It was a routine transit by a carrier strike group, maintaining presence, visibility, and readiness. But below the flight deck, inside the ship's command center, the situation began to look very different. A radar technician leaned closer to his screen. New surface contacts had appeared. Not one, not two, 6. They showed up almost at the same time, spread across the display from different directions. At first, they might have looked like ordinary regional traffic. But within moments, the system marked something unusual. None of the vessels were transmitting AIS identification. No automatic signals, no commercial markers. And their movement did not resemble normal civilian shipping. They were adjusting with purpose. The contacts were approaching from several angles, closing the distance at a steady, deliberate pace. They were not racing in, and they were not drifting randomly. They were changing course in a way that suggested coordination. To experienced naval watch teams, the pattern was clear. This was not random movement. It was a controlled convergence. The bridge was informed immediately. The range was still not critical, but the formation was enough to demand close attention. The order was calm and direct. Record everything, track continuously, maintain course. There was no sudden turn, no increase in speed, no visible sign of panic. The carrier continued forward with professional restraint. Minute by minute, the 6 contacts drew closer. What had started as a wide arc slowly tightened, bearings shifted, distances shortened. The estimated closest approach dropped below 5 nautical miles and continued decreasing. Radio calls were sent over international maritime frequencies. No answer. A second call followed, this time repeated in Spanish. Again, nothing. Silence at sea can mean many things. In this moment, it appeared intentional. By 3:49 p.m., optical sensors confirmed what the radar picture had already suggested. The contacts were Venezuelan naval vessels, patrol ships and smaller military units, far less massive than the carrier, but clearly official. Hull numbers were recorded. Mast profiles matched known Venezuelan classes. Crews could be seen on deck. Their wakes were sharp and deliberate. 6 military vessels, 1 aircraft carrier. The difference in size and capability was obvious. But at sea, influence is not only measured by size. In close-range encounters, distance itself becomes pressure. The risk comes from proximity, movement, timing, and the chance of miscalculation. Inside the command center, the mood stayed controlled. No shouting, no confusion, no unnecessary alarms. Systems continued tracking. Radar data updated second by second. Electronic sensors quietly monitored emissions, frequencies, and behavior. This was not yet a direct confrontation, but it was no longer routine. At 3:53 p.m., one Venezuelan vessel made a sharper course change, moving closer toward the carrier's starboard quarter. Another vessel mirrored the action from the opposite side. 2 more slowed slightly ahead of the carrier's path, while the remaining pair held position farther behind. A loose ring was beginning to form. To an untrained observer, it might have looked scattered. To naval professionals, the meaning was unmistakable. It was controlled pressure without physical contact, a show of presence designed to test reactions, create attention, and possibly draw a response. On board USS George Washington, no one rushed to the rails. No aircraft were sent up. No dramatic warning followed beyond the standard maritime calls. The carrier stayed on its heading, steady and predictable. Because in moments like this, every action becomes a message. And the strongest message the U.S. Navy could send was discipline. At 3:56 p.m., the nearest Venezuelan vessel moved inside 3 nautical miles. That was the point every watchstander understood. This was no longer simple observation. It had become a close maritime encounter, and the situation was beginning to intensify quickly. By 3:57 p.m., the full shape of the encounter was clear. 6 Venezuelan naval vessels had taken distinct positions around the carrier's projected route. 2 were positioned forward, offset just enough to demand attention. 2 were pacing along the sides. 2 more followed at a measured distance behind. None were close enough to touch. All were close enough to matter. Inside the command center aboard USS George Washington, every movement was being recorded in real time. Bearings were updated, speeds were recalculated, closest points of approach were refined down to tenths of a nautical mile. This was not guesswork, it was training, precision, and experience working together. The carrier maintained its steady speed, no course change, no visible reaction. The decision was intentional. In naval practice, staying predictable under pressure is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of control. Sudden movement can be misunderstood. Holding course removes any easy excuse for the other side to claim confusion, while making it clear that any unsafe action belongs to the approaching vessels. At 3:59 p.m., the first Venezuelan ship moved inside 2.5 nautical miles. Its wake grew sharper as its engines pushed slightly harder. Optical feeds showed activity near the bridge and forward deck. No visible systems were being aimed. Nothing suggested an immediate direct move, but the posture was clearly alert. Another radio message was sent. This is a United States Navy vessel operating in international waters. You are approaching at an unsafe distance. State your intentions. The channel stayed silent. Electronic sensors picked up brief, low-power radar activity. It was not the kind associated with a direct engagement system, but it was active scanning, the sort of signal used to build awareness, measure reactions, and test boundaries. Every signal was recorded. This was the gray zone, the space between routine presence and open confrontation, where pressure is applied carefully and the legal line is never clearly crossed. Venezuela was using distance as a tool, relying on proximity to create tension without taking one obvious step too far. On the carrier's bridge, the captain watched without rushing. There was no need for dramatic action because the response was already happening quietly. Escort ships adjusted with subtle precision, preserving protective spacing without making a show of it. Aviation crews remained prepared, not hurried but ready. The carrier's defensive systems stayed passive, listening instead of broadcasting. At 4:03 p.m., the formation tightened again. One Venezuelan vessel ahead reduced speed, forcing the escorts to account for less sea room. Another crossed laterally near the carrier's projected route, still outside immediate danger, but close enough to reduce reaction time. The remaining ships held their places, completing the image of a moving ring. This was not random. It required coordination, communication, and intent. Still, there was no reply to the radio calls. In encounters like this, silence often says the most. It gives one side room to claim later that nothing was received, nothing was understood, nothing was ordered. Ambiguity becomes protection. But ambiguity can work both ways. By 4:06 p.m., the closest point of approach dropped below 2 nautical miles. That did not cross a legal boundary, but it crossed a professional one. At that range, even a small steering mistake could turn a tense moment into a serious international incident. Inside the command center, the update was delivered calmly. The contact was maneuvering with clear intent. No alarms, no raised voices, no confusion. Procedures moved exactly as they were supposed to. Non-lethal response options were reviewed. Aviation assets were prepared for possible observation, not as a show of force, but to document what was happening from above. Cameras, sensors, and recorders became the priority. Evidence mattered more than drama, because if the encounter went wrong, the story would not be shaped by whoever spoke the loudest. It would be shaped by whoever had the clearest record. From the Venezuelan ships, the crews could now fully see what they were moving around. The carrier's island rose high above the water. The flight deck stretched farther than the length of their own vessels. Radar arrays and antennas remained still, almost calm in appearance. That calm was deliberate. At 4:09 p.m., the Venezuelan formation showed a slight hesitation. One ship reduced speed by a small amount. Another made a minor course correction. It was enough to notice, but not enough to disengage. They were testing the limit. The carrier did not react visibly, because in the U.S. Navy, a stronger response is not driven by pride. It is driven by necessity. And at that moment, necessity had not yet arrived. But the margin for error was narrowing. Everyone involved, on every bridge and inside every operations room, understood the same reality. The next move would determine whether this stayed a controlled demonstration or turned into something far more serious. At 4:11 p.m., the tone of the encounter shifted. Not with shouting, not with a dramatic maneuver, not with anything obvious to an outside observer. It changed inside the systems. Electronic sensors aboard USS George Washington detected a new pattern. One of the Venezuelan vessels had increased the strength and consistency of its radar emissions. It still did not indicate a direct engagement posture, but it was no longer casual background activity. They were actively gathering information. Inside the command center, the data was unmistakable. Frequency bands, pulse patterns, sweep timing, and signal behavior were all cataloged in real time. The carrier did not answer electronically. It did not need to answer. Listening was enough. This was no longer only about ships moving across the sea. The encounter had now expanded into the invisible space of signals, sensors, and electronic activity. By 4:13 p.m., the closest Venezuelan vessel tightened its turn again, angling toward the carrier's starboard side. The distance dropped below 2 nautical miles. At that range, details were impossible to miss. Deck crews could see helmets, faces, and hands gripping railings. Still, no visible systems were being directed. Still, no radio reply came back. The U.S. Navy's posture remained calm and unchanged. But beneath that steady surface, multiple layers of readiness were quietly coming online. Escort ships shifted their positions by small degrees, not by dramatic turns. The changes were subtle enough to be missed on camera, but important enough to improve coverage. Protective angles were preserved. Blind spots were reduced. Every adjustment was measured to keep the carrier secure without pushing the situation further. On the flight deck, aviation crews received quiet updates. There was no rushed launch order, no dramatic movement, and no visible urgency. A helicopter sat prepared, rotors still, crew already strapped in. Its purpose, if needed, would not be confrontation. It would be observation. At sea, clear vision matters. At 4:15 p.m., one Venezuelan vessel slipped slightly out of formation, drifting toward the rear before correcting back into place. Another slowed down, forcing its partner to adjust. These were small signs, but experienced watch teams noticed them immediately. The coordination was starting to show strain. Maintaining pressure at sea is not easy. It requires discipline, timing, and confidence. The closer ships get, the harder it becomes to hide hesitation. Inside the command center, a new classification was entered into the log. Escalatory behavior, non-kinetic. That phrase matters. It means the situation had moved beyond simple navigation and into the realm of intent. It did not call for a forceful response, but it did reduce the number of available options. Another radio message was sent. Short, professional, and fully recorded. This is a United States Navy vessel. Your maneuvers are unsafe. Alter course immediately. Again, there was no response. By 4:18 p.m., the Venezuelan ships had almost completed a loose ring around the carrier. It was not tight enough to block movement, but not wide enough to appear casual. It was a formation meant to be noticed, a message designed not only for the ships at sea, but for audiences far away from the water. But maritime encounters are not judged by appearance alone. They are judged by control. The carrier held its speed, held its course, held its discipline. There were no sudden turns, no visible reaction, no dramatic display. That decision placed the responsibility for safe movement directly on the surrounding vessels. If something went wrong now, the record would show exactly who had created the risk. At 4:20 p.m., systems aboard the carrier quietly shifted into a more focused mode. Sensors refined their attention. This was not an active challenge, and it was not a public display. It was readiness. The difference mattered. Readiness shortens response time, and when response time gets shorter, every small mistake becomes more serious. The Venezuelan commanders understood that. They could feel the pressure even if they could not see every detail. The longer they stayed close, the less room they had to maneuver, both physically and politically. One ship eased its speed slightly, another drifted outward by a few degrees. It was not a withdrawal, but it was not full commitment either. This was the edge. No one had raised their voice, no one had taken the final step. But the encounter had reached the point where systems, timing, and discipline could decide what happened next. And systems do not debate, they respond. By 4:22 p.m., the standoff balanced on a narrow line between presence and provocation, between controlled pressure and dangerous miscalculation. The question was no longer whether the situation could intensify. The real question was whether either side would allow it to. And the next phase was already beginning. At 4:23 p.m., the encounter reached its turning point. Not with a loud warning, not with a sudden move across the water, but with air shifting above the sea. A U.S. Navy helicopter lifted smoothly from the deck of USS George Washington, its rotors cutting clean circles through the humid Caribbean air. There was no sharp climb and no dramatic approach. The aircraft rose to a controlled altitude and moved steadily toward the outer edge of the Venezuelan formation. This was not a display of threat, it was a display of clarity. From the cockpit, the crew could now see the entire surface picture. High-resolution optics captured hull numbers, deck activity, and bridge behavior. Infrared sensors tracked exhaust, engine output, and heat signatures. Every frame was time-stamped. Every angle was recorded. The helicopter remained at a safe distance. Always visible, always steady, always controlled. That mattered. Intense maritime encounters, risk often grows from uncertainty. Uncertainty about distance, uncertainty about intent, uncertainty about what each side believes it is seeing. The helicopter reduced that uncertainty. It made the situation visible from above, and it made the record impossible to ignore. At 4:25 p.m., one Venezuelan ship adjusted slightly outward, breaking the symmetry of the ring. The move was small but unmistakable. Moments later, another vessel reduced speed, its wake flattening as the engines eased back. The formation was beginning to loosen. No commands were shouted. No additional warnings were needed beyond standard procedure. The U.S. Navy did not need to force the moment. Pressure was now working in both directions. The helicopter held its orbit. Sensors focused, communication stayed minimal. Its presence sent a clear message without needing to say much. Everything happening here is being watched, recorded, and preserved. Not for spectacle, but for accountability. On the Venezuelan bridges, the calculation began to change. Staying close now meant accepting more risk while gaining less influence. Every extra minute in tight proximity increased the chance of a mistake. Every recorded maneuver made it harder to deny what had happened later, and every system across the carrier and its escorts remained ready, not aggressive, but fully prepared. At 4:28 p.m., another Venezuelan vessel shifted outward by several degrees. The formation no longer looked like a ring. It had become an arc, still present, still observing, but no longer closing in. The difference was now obvious. 6 ships could create the image of surrounding a carrier, but they could not surround its awareness. The carrier strike group controlled the information space, radar, optics, electronic signatures, timing, and the legal record. Venezuela could use proximity to apply pressure, but it could not maintain control in that environment. By 4:30 p.m., the helicopter completed a slow pass along the outer edge of the formation, then widened its orbit. The movement was careful and deliberate. It did not hover over decks. It did not attempt to intimidate. It simply maintained distance and documented the situation. On the water, the Venezuelan ships continued making small adjustments, slight course changes, minor reductions in speed, gradual increases in spacing. No single move announced that the encounter was ending, but together they made the message clear. The peak had passed. Inside the carrier's command center, the assessment was updated. Pressure decreasing, formation weakening. That did not mean celebration. It meant stability. USS George Washington held its course, held its speed, held its discipline. There was no reason to press forward dramatically, no reason to pursue. In gray zone confrontations, restraint is often what keeps the advantage intact. At 4:33 p.m., the helicopter turned back toward the carrier. Its task was complete. It had provided visibility, clarity, and consequence without forcing a stronger reaction. Behind it, the Venezuelan vessels continued to widen their distance. The loose arcs stretched farther apart, returning toward a more normal operating range. The ring was gone. No direct action had been taken. No dramatic orders echoed across the water. No final line had been crossed. Yet the outcome was clear. The encounter had tested proximity, intent, and resolve. And when the pressure reached its limit, only one side remained fully in control of the situation. By the time the helicopter settled back onto the deck, the carrier strike group was already returning to a routine posture. Because for the U.S. Navy, the goal had never been confrontation. The goal was control, and control had been maintained. By 4:36 p.m., the Caribbean Sea began to look calm again. The Venezuelan vessels were no longer moving as one. Distances increased, bearings steadied. What remained was presence without pressure. 6 ships were now operating separately, no longer trying to influence the carrier's movement. From the bridge of USS George Washington, the scene appeared ordinary once more. Engine steady, course unchanged. The carrier continued exactly as planned, its transit uninterrupted. But what had just happened would not disappear with the fading wake. Below deck, the real work continued. Inside the command center, the encounter was being closed out step by step. Radar tracks were finalized, timestamps were checked, optical footage was matched with electronic logs. Every radio call, every course change, every signal pattern was organized into one complete record. This was not routine paperwork. In modern naval operations, documentation is part of deterrence. It establishes responsibility, it removes uncertainty, and it ensures that if questions come later from governments, allies, or international institutions, the answers are exact. The Venezuelan ships had not taken the final step. Neither had the United States. But intent had been observed, measured, and recorded. From a tactical point of view, the result was clear. The carrier strike group kept its freedom of movement. There was no course change, no loss of speed, and no delay to operations. The surrounding vessels moved away without forcing the situation further. From a strategic point of view, the meaning was larger. Encounters like this are not about winning a battle. They are about shaping behavior. Venezuela had tested proximity as a pressure tool, a gray zone method designed to provoke a reaction while staying just below the legal threshold. The U.S. Navy answered with discipline, visibility, and control. No sudden turns, no provocative signals, no forceful reaction. Just a steady presence, fully recorded and impossible to ignore. At sea, power is not measured by who moves closest. It is measured by who controls the pace of events. And throughout this encounter, that pace remained in the hands of the carrier strike group. As the distance between the ships increased, the escort vessels quietly returned to their standard protective positions. Aviation crews secured their equipment. Sensors shifted back into routine monitoring. The transition looked effortless because it had been practiced many times before. Professional navies do not turn restraint into a performance. They make it part of the system. By 4:42 p.m., the Venezuelan vessels were operating well outside the unsafe zone. The encounter was effectively finished. No formal message followed, none was needed. At sea, silence after disengagement can be just as intentional as movement. It allows both sides to step back without public escalation. It preserves stability without forcing anyone to make a statement. And that silence carried its own meaning. USS George Washington continued its transit through international waters, exactly as international law permits. The surrounding ocean slowly returned to normal traffic patterns. To anyone looking hours later, there would have been no obvious sign of what had taken place. But the systems remembered. Every radar sweep, every course change, every moment of close proximity, every signal, every unanswered call, those records would shape future decisions, not only in the Caribbean, but anywhere similar pressure tactics are tested against disciplined naval presence. Because the lesson of this encounter was not loud or dramatic, it was procedural. When challenged at sea, escalation is not automatic. Discipline can decide the outcome, documentation can outweigh pressure, and control does not always require confrontation. The Venezuelan ships had approached with clear intent. They had applied pressure. They had tested distance, timing, and reaction. But when the situation reached its limit, they pulled back. Not because they were publicly forced to, but because the balance of the encounter left them with no better option. No major incident unfolded that afternoon. No dramatic warning echoed across the water. No breaking headline appeared in the moment. Yet the message was clear. At sea, restraint backed by capability is not weakness. It is control.